Hey there, Risa with Core Integrity. I want to discuss today the role of woman in relationship and some of the challenges specifically with modern women. But don't think that this video is purely for women, because to understand the role of woman is to understand the role of the feminine principle to some extent, which is also relevant for men, and also helpful to try and understand how this plays out in relationship. So, and I've spoken about this in so many words in other videos, but it's important to understand that woman's orientation in herself, in her nature, puts her and places her a little bit more deeply into the earth and into the unconscious, into that which is slightly below the immediate field of awareness or consciousness. And this is why women often serve that function in relationship of being a reflective, being the reflecting principle or the mirror principle, the mirroring principle. And in fact, we're always mirroring to one another. That is the nature of relationship itself as an archetypal principle. But we often see that it is the case, and the Jungians understood this as well, that it is oftentimes the woman who is bringing new consciousness or the invitation to new consciousness into the relationship. And that doesn't mean that the man doesn't contribute, because he often contributes in a myriad of different ways. But there's a specific reason why this occurs in this manner. And it is because of woman's orientation towards the earth that she tends to feel that which is in the unconscious before the man can see it. And so that will often show up in woman starting to sense and see something in her man that he's not conscious of. And it can show up in all kinds of ways, but usually it starts with a feeling of dissatisfaction or a sense of feeling separation, or even just an intuitive hunch of, perhaps something is missing here, or something's not fully crystallized yet in the awareness, either in myself or in my relationship with the man here. Something is trying to make itself known or make itself crystallized. And sometimes it can be that simple. It can be just simply an interior impulse or hunch from the woman's own interior space. And other times it can come up through dramas or conflicts or situations in the relationship. So it can be a combination of both. It doesn't necessarily have to be one way or the other. It could show up sometimes just if there's a conversation happening, and then all of a sudden there's a defensiveness or a sharpness, or there's resistance happening for some reason. And so then you go, oh, okay, there's some material here that's needs to be unpackaged and to reveal itself. And as I said, I'm talking generally about woman's role here. There can be times when a man will see something that the woman is not as well. So it's not universally true, but oftentimes it will be woman in that position. So when we talk about the ways in which, let's say, there's been a masculine imbalance or a slight leaning to the masculine way, at least in the West, the way that that plays out in relationship really is the ways in which a woman, through having been shut down by the egocentrism or the defensiveness of the man's conscious part of him, his personality, the ways in which she turns away from her own intuitive reflection. And so then the question is, why does man turn away from that? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. Again, if a woman is feeling something that's moving in the man before he is conscious of it, it's, his what appears as his defensiveness or his arrogance or his combativeness or his dismissal even, or I'm talking about active things here, but it could even be that he retracts or disappears off, withdraws from intimacy or something like this. Whatever it's appearing as, it's because there's something in his unconscious that he hasn't touched. It's an insecurity, a fear, a past trauma in relationship to woman. There's something that's being activated in his system. And when that happens, we're talking about the stimulation of the feminine aspect in himself to some degree, because it's that which is in the unconscious. So therefore it's in the territory of yin. It's a yin energy. And so because we can say in general that a man being a biological man, and yes, the biology does play a role in our fundamental leanings, even in the case of men who are a little bit more feminine and women who are a bit more masculine, that the conscious aspect, which is a masculine aspect, a man will tend to express that a little bit more in the relationship. And there's a beauty to how that works out together. It's a naturally very harmonious as a design. But right, we've got a lot of issues where we've lived in a hyper-mental society for a while to the exclusion of some other aspects. So there's just a lot to clear up here. And of course that begins in the woman first, because for the woman watching, you have to see that you have to take responsibility for bringing the wisdom of your own essence into the relationship and using that as a support system for the man when he is hitting up against something in himself that is difficult for him to meet. And there are plenty of women who have a hard time meeting their own unconscious. So it's not like all women are masterful at this, but her capacity to be masterful at it will always just often slightly supersede him, just because when she does start putting her attention there properly and taking responsibility in her own masculinity to relate to her own unconscious depth, then she's able to move with that much more intuitively. You even see this play out with, you can see when a dog has a litter of pups and the pups go and get microchipped. It's often the case that when the boys get microchipped, they squeal right away, and often the girls don't. So even though men are stronger externally, there's a compensation for that in terms of a woman's interior strength when she is in a proper and mature alignment with her essence, which is, of course, is very key, because there are obviously plenty of women who aren't, and therefore they can't really relate to their own depth, or there are plenty of women who are afraid of their own depth in that way, and they turn away. And that, in that example, a woman's own conscious aspect, her yang or masculine aspect, has that sort of attitude towards her own unconscious. So if that's going on inside of the woman, then how can the woman expect the man to meet her in her own depth before she can do it herself, right? So this is the responsibility that women have to step into. And the responsibility to support, going back to what I was saying before, support the man in that aspect of his descending into himself. It can be really hard to meet whatever is down there. One of the big challenges that a woman has is the amount of personal feeling and hurt that can be around the rejection that can happen when the man, through his, and it's not because the man is trying to hurt, unless you're with a really abusive person. The reality is that the man is not trying to hurt the woman. It may play out that way externally and superficially, but it's not his intention. It's just he's turning away, or he's projecting or blaming or suspicion, withdrawing. That is happening because there's something in him that he's meeting which is difficult. So it's really about, it's like he can't really meet the woman in that encounter prior to meeting himself. So one of the big tasks that women struggle with, that I see with this, is the woman having enough objectivity in herself and being able to hold her own emotional upset to whatever degree she feels rejected or hurt that the man is either retracting from her or maybe projecting onto her or dismissing her. For the woman to be able to feel that pain, but also try and hold enough room to attempt to facilitate a degree of dialogue about the issue at hand. And that can take a while, it can take a lot of practice. And this is assuming, of course, that you're in a relationship with someone who is willing to enter into those difficult conversations. And that requires a baseline of a willingness towards truth and honesty, and a willingness to work towards cultivating new intimacy. Or new intimacy? Cultivating intimacy, period. Okay, a lot of people get into relationships out of convenience and comfort, really. And that's of course why a lot of relationships go stale, because there's that initial attraction that brings two people together. And that attraction, or that strong phase in the beginning, then usually develops into a comfort where there's just more of a natural, that the energy is a bit less polarizing and there's a bit more of that natural harmony that develops. But then that can grow stale after a time if there isn't that next phase of going deeper into that new level of maturity. And here we see the feminine aspect of relationship as it pertains to the human dimension, where whenever we're talking about the feminine or the yin principle, we're talking about roots, we're talking about depth. And I always think of a big tree, you know, those crazy 300-year-old trees, and they're massive and their trunks are huge and they're massively tall and they climb so high, but then you look to the roots and you see how massively twisted and long, and how great the roots are. And that's like life. You know, Jung said, you know, you can't, something about having to have your roots reach all the way down to hell to be able to stretch up to heaven, something to that effect. And so that's why, in terms of relationship as an organic principle, a life principle, a naturally unfolding principle, the feminine as the roots becomes the ground and the foundation of that relationship. And so that's why this is where the deepening of the intimacy happens. And that process of going down into the unconscious and meeting that layer of pain, or meeting that whatever comes up, is, at least in the beginning, quite hard for people, because we come up against such intense pains and traumas and resistances to intimacy, and all of those little tiny twists and turns in ourselves where we want to avoid that and make it about the other person, or just all of the different myriad of things that go on that play out in relationships in that way. So the old tendency for man in, let's say, the old type of relationship was for him to hold that protecting and providing archetype, which of course is important, but to remain disconnected from his own depth, and maybe the woman just showing an image of that principle, but that using the woman as an excuse. Okay, like my wife is doing that, so I don't have to relate to that depth. And unfortunately for him, it means that he can never meet his own inner power and strength in terms of finding his own roots. So once again, you want to keep climbing and striving and achieving, and that achievement orientation is that masculine way. And this isn't a bad thing at all, but if you're just achievement, it's again like, think of yourself as a little tree. It's like you're climbing up, but really you should be pulling your roots down. And once you're down deep rooted enough, then it becomes that much easier to sprout upward. So the task for woman is to, one, begin understanding herself as that living principle in her own being and through her own body. A woman doesn't really have any hope at that intimacy with a man to the degree that she's cut off from understanding herself as that principle. Women have to go through that pathway of maturation in being willing to bring the reflection, or to bring the invitation to new consciousness, even if the man's ego part doesn't want to hear it in that moment. And that's usually where women have trouble, because women are often a bit more sensitive. They want to feel connected and harmonized with the man, but there's a reality of, like, you have to go through that conflict or that resistance. You have to bring up the reality of whatever separation is happening for that to get to a point where it can dissolve, and then the unity can happen. So a woman has to develop that strength and that confidence through her own self-trust to say, hey, look, this is what I'm seeing. I'm bringing this to the table. When I see you moving this way, it hurts me, and I see that you're hurting yourself, or you're looking away from this and you shouldn't be. Whatever it is. Or, whatever it is. So that is the learning process that a woman has to go through. She has to be humble enough to her own essence, for her own conscious mind, as her own masculine to some degree, to pay attention to and listen to her own unconscious and go, you know what, I'm really seeing this, and yes, if I bring it to the table, I'm going to have to like bring up the conflict or whatever, and he'll say that I'm bringing drama to the table or whatever, or complaining. But of course that's not what you're doing, right? Of course that can happen in relationships if the woman is immature and it's that nitpicking, me. But that's not what we're talking about here. And sometimes for the women watching, the man will see you in that way, even if what you're bringing is clear and truthful and honest, and ultimately in the end will be for his benefit. Once he comes around to it, it'll only serve to bring him more psychic energy and resources and self-trust in himself. But you know, you're going to come up against all of his resistances and judgments and fears of his own depth, his own unconscious and his own intuition, and whatever is in there, whatever information is in there relative to women from the past or from the mother, that you bringing a clear face, bringing a clear mirror, is going to bring up in him in terms of his distorted perceptions. Now, I'm talking about women here today. There's a version of this for men as well, because there are circumstances where men get into relationships with women where the woman is still serving as a reflective principle, but she's immature and unconscious, and so the reflection she's giving is always a bit, it's not a true reflection, it's maybe reflecting a man's self-rejection. So there's obviously plenty of situations where the man brings his pure expression to woman and she's resistant to it and doesn't want to borrow it. So, you know, we're never really fixed with any of these patterns of relating. But when you are in a relationship and the two people are committed and it's built on a ground of love and honesty and a willingness to enter into that arena of challenge and depth and the growing of intimacy, because it's one thing to fall in love, then that process of growing in love is a psychologically unfolding process of maturation, of self-growth, challenge. It's got all of these elements to it. So if you are in a relationship that's built on the grounds of that, then you will end up seeing that the woman will start to hold this polarity of, or hold this foundation of bringing something new from the unconscious, and challenging the conscious mind. And that begins with her challenging her own things and then bringing that also into the relationship with the man. So in the beginning of my relationship with James, this played out, and initially for the first period of our relationship, it caused quite a bit of friction, and it was quite a clash and a drama and very emotional and intense. But as we practiced that over time, we just got better and better at that process. I got better at bringing the reflection through my own communication, and I started to get less personally hurt across time, or be able to hold that with a bit more flexibility. James got better at recognizing his own resistances or patterns in himself, so when it would come up again, I could just point it out and go, oh, it's this thing, and then he'd go, oh yeah, okay. And so it's like anything that you master in life, where you just get more and more efficient at it. It is a living process. And when you're operating with the right principles and you're paying proper attention, it should have the effect in life of improving across time. And if that's not happening, then there's something off in your principle or the way you're approaching the process to begin with. So you have to start with the right understanding and the right foundations. So to summarize, for women watching, you have to begin to relate to your own essence and be willing to stand up in courage to bring the conflict that's already going on in the unconscious to the table, and be willing to stick it out in terms of learning how to have the battle of the egos until the egos dissolve, and then there's the intimacy. You have to get courageous enough to be able to do that. And as you go along with that, getting more and more refined in terms of not making the man's apparent rejection or withdrawal from you a personal issue relative to you. Of course, it hurts personally because you want to feel unified. So there's always a degree of personal pain. But getting to that point where you can see, there's just something in him that's blocking him off from himself, which is affecting his relationship with me in this moment. At least when we're talking about a woman seeing something unfolding in the relationship through his movement. or responding or reacting to his movement. Okay, that's all for now. See you next time.